Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here with Dr. Amy Jo Levine. We are going to be talking about the scandal of the Jewish Jesus and basically discussing, Dr. Levine. Is that correct, or did I get it
That
wrong?
is correct.
Okay, Dr. Levine's work, and so she
But
said I
you
can
should
call
just
her.
call me AJ. I think that would make things
Okay,
much more friendly.
okay. So AJ has asked me, or rather, AJ and I will be talking about her work, her scholarship, and especially a lot of the really impressive material that you've done on informing Christians about, greater sensitivity and awareness of Judaism. And so, thank you so much for coming on to my show. Could you briefly introduce yourself to my audience?
Sure. My name is AJ Levine. I'm a Jew who has spent a career studying Jesus in his Jewish context. I am staggered that Christians who claim to love Jesus don't really care about the context, because it seems to me if you love somebody, you'd want to know about, well, where did you come from and what was life like and who are your friends? And, if you come from a place different from where you live, I live in Tennessee. I teach at Vanderbilt University. If I meet somebody who comes from Manila or comes from Paris or comes from the Ukraine, what do you eat and what are your friends like and what do you do for fun and what annoys you, right? So it seems to me if you love Jesus, you ought to love something about the context. And it floors me that people tend to look at that context as something really, really negative and awful, and see Jesus as the only person who cared about, women's rights and social justice and healthcare, rather than see him as a fully human being embedded in a particular society and drawing from that society, which would include what Christians would call the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to make Jesus safe for Jews and more important for Christians. I don't think you need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good.
Yeah, I mean that's wonderful, and I mean some of the scholarly work that you've done is was it the Jewish Annotated New Testament? I got my copy I think a few months ago, and so yeah, it's just a great resource. It's been praised, and people have said so many good things about it. And then I know Dr. Levine, you have a book on the Pharisees coming out soon.
Do in
Is that in
December.
December? Correct?
It will launch in December from Erdman's.
Yeah.
It's a series of essays, which I co-edited with a fellow named Joseph Sievers, who is a priest who just retired from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
where I was teaching in the spring of 2019. This is pre-COVID. And Joseph had this wonderful idea of doing an international conference on the Pharisees, because we actually don't know all that much about them.
Mm-hmm.
The only self-identified Pharisee we have is Paul, which is just weird when you think about it. But there are references in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Gospels, obviously, in rabbinic sources and Josephus and so on. So we thought, well, let's have this big conference and figure out what it is that we know. So massive international conference in Rome, got an audience with the Pope, which is fabulous. Got the Pope to give us a little talk, which we now have published in the book. It's also on the Vatican website. And we're hoping to bring a little bit more honesty and a little bit less stereotyping to Pharisees. The Pope has already said, don't use the Pharisees as negative examples. That's bearing false witness against them. Again, you don't need to make Jewish groups look bad in order to make Jesus look good.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's basically the subject of our conversation today. And especially, you're coming at this from not only a scholarly perspective, but a perspective that is informed, right? It's not just you have an agenda in a way, but it's like,
well, I mean, you kind of hope that scholars would be informed. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm biased. Of course, I'm biased. All historians are biased. We just don't admit it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm biased. I want to locate Jesus in his own context rather than yanking him out of context, because that's what good historians do. And when it comes to Christology, can I use that term to your does your audience know what that means?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Raw, because I don't know your folks that well, right?
Yep.
So when it comes to Christology, I want that fully human part of Jesus to be embedded appropriately. And when it comes to ethics, I don't want people leaving church after hearing a sermon thinking, God, those Jews were just a bunch of crappy people.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a bias. I want to prevent anti-Semitism. I want to prevent Jew hatred, and I want a better historical knowledge of the person people claim is God on earth.
Yeah, well, let's get started then with some of the questions that I have prepared. So one of them was, why do you believe, or why do you think that the Jewishness of Jesus has largely been ignored, overlooked, or even, I have it here in quotes, erased?
Yeah. Well, even worse than erased, it's been negatively categorized.
Mm.
And there are several reasons for that. As the church became increasingly Gentile or pagan, whatever term, not Jewish, not Samaritan, so everybody else, that original Jewish basis got lost. As Paul spends a lot of time telling his Gentile audiences, because Paul tells us he's the apostle to the Gentiles, he's writing to Gentile churches. And he's saying to them, you are now equal to Jews in terms of being part of this God's chosen people model. It's an extension rather than a replacement. But you come into this Messianic age system, not as Jews, you come in as Gentiles. So don't keep the dietary regulations and don't get yourself circumcised. And it's not even clear that Paul wanted people to honor the Sabbath. In the Gentile churches, he wanted them to honor the Lord's Day. And there was a reason for that. Paul was a Jew who thought the Messiah had come. So what happens when the Messiah comes? Well, one of the signs of the Messianic age is that the Gentiles turn from their pagan gods to worship the God of Israel. The prophet Zechariah talks about the day that 10 Gentiles grab hold of the Jew and say, take me with you to Zion, because we've heard God is with you, like, let's go. But they don't say, oh, and circumcise us when we get there. Because if that were the case, the only people who would be part of God's people would be Jews, but everybody has to be part, because God's the God of the world, not just the God of the Jews. But as the church became increasingly Gentile, the Gentiles lost that Jewish component, which was the bedrock. And eventually they came to the point where not only were Gentiles not supposed to follow these things that made Jews distinct, Jews in the churches weren't supposed to follow them either. And the more the majority of Jewish people did not sign on to the program because they didn't think the Messianic age had arrived. I mean, one person coming back, good for him, but they were expecting everybody. The world was not at peace. People weren't beating their swords into plowshares. The sword business was doing just fine. The Jews who had been dispersed to all corners of the Roman Empire were not gathered back to Zion. So they concluded Jesus was not the Messiah. And the church had to figure out, what do we do with these folks? Because they should have signed on to the program. Paul pushes it off to the end of time. At all Israel will be saved, like at that second coming moment. Okay, great. So you sort of get it by. Matthew blames it on their leaders, but that only lasts for a little bit of time. And John concludes they're children of the devil and they weren't supposed to get it in the first place and they're never going to get it. And too bad. And the church, because belief in the Christ was so obvious to the followers of Jesus. It's like, the hand in front of your face, you could see it. It's obvious. They had to deal with these Jews for whom it was not obvious. And they thought it should have been because they went back to the scriptures that they shared, the church's Old Testament. And so, but this all points to Jesus. And the Jews are going, well, no, if you wear these Christian lenses, yeah, it does. But if you take those lenses off and you put like rabbinic lenses on, you're going to see a bunch of other stuff, but you're not going to see Jesus there. So how do we deal with these people who can't see what's right in front of them? They must be deliberately rejecting, therefore they must be evil, they must be children of Satan, John 8, and there you go.
And yeah, I mean, and then throughout time, then for Christians like that, I mean, that describes like the parting of the ways, at least maybe the first, like maybe the first 1,000 years perhaps, or something like that.
Yeah, probably about the first 400 to 500. By 500, okay. Under the Roman Empire, Christian Roman emperors, they're pretty much separated.
Yeah, and then do you have any thoughts on then the contemporary kind of lack of, let's say, well, I mean, I know that that's changing in more contemporary scholarship, right? But I mean, even in a lot of just people today, or even the last 100 years, like they don't really want to talk much about the Jewishness of Jesus.
Well, they're first of all, they're ignorant about it, and people don't like to talk about stuff that they're ignorant about. Second, I think they find that Judaism to be parochial or strange or weird, because it's not contemporary Judaism, it's first century Judaism. First century Judaism, what he's wearing fringes, right? Which ultra-Orthodox men wear to this day, because the book of Numbers commands you put fringes on the corners of your garments to remind you of Torah. Well, that seems a little, fashion sense is a little weird. He keeps the dietary regulations. He did not declare all foods clean. Because if he did, then that food fight that Peter and Paul had never would have happened, and Acts 15 would have been irrelevant. So that's Mark's extrapolation. He's a person so embedded in his own context. But what happens? The church has universalized him. So people imagine that Jesus is God on earth, but you want God to look like you look. So you got a bunch of blonde people portraying a bunch of, blonde Nordic or Jesuses, and you got a bunch of Italian people portraying Jesus as Italian, and Native American Jesuses and Korean Jesuses and whatever. But Jewish Jesuses, Rembrandt did a pretty good job, but for the most part, that's we don't want to deal with that. Just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, and
it's sometimes called the scandal of particularity.
Yeah, I mean that kind of actually leads to my second question, which is what is so scandalous, right, about the Jewishness of Jesus, or the perceived scandalousness of it?
Yeah, because he came to his own. He's got a job description, is to deal with the people in Israel.
Yeah.
And people don't want it. I want him to deal with me personally, in America or wherever. It's also scandalous to think that God would be particular rather than universal. And the reason that's scandalous is because the universal is the majority. When you're in the majority, generally, and this is cross-cultural, you think that everybody should think the way you think. In the United States, we would call that privilege. Everybody's like us, right? So everybody has the same opportunities because, we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, and all people are created equal. So people who are privileged tend to think that, well, we have a Christian majority, and they're wondering, why are these people being different? Why aren't they just melding in like everybody else? That's particularity. It's a scandal to think that the God of the world would choose one particular people and say, yeah, I'm going to work with you guys for a while, and I'm going to keep that covenant. And if somebody else gets grandfathered in later, or to use Paul's language, adopted in later, that's scandalous for people who have that adoption status.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I kind of in my own conversations, because so I'm Catholic, but whenever I talk to kind of Protestants and I try to show them, wait a minute, like a lot of the later ecclesiology that occurred from the Reformation doesn't really line up with like the early church or early, or Judaism of the time. There's kind of an insistence, like, no, but like, I have a relationship with Jesus, right? And Jesus, to me, this Jesus you're proposing seems so inaccessible, so foreign, so different. And I'm like, what do you think he is? Like, he's not a 21st century gentleman. There's certainly a distinction to be had there.
Well, here's the Protestant example is a good example of where that particularity becomes a problem. Protestant example, the way it cashes out generally, I don't mean all Protestants everywhere,
right,
but the way it cashes out generally is Christ is my savior personally. It's me and God, or it's God and I, right? Not in a community.
Yeah.
Not mediated by the church. It's Luther in his study going, yeah, I got it, right? The Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy preserve the more communal sense that Jews had. That is, where 2 or 3 or 10 are gathered in my name. You need that community. It's not I don't think it's appropriate for a priest to celebrate Mass just on his own. There should be somebody else, because you don't celebrate by yourself. So the Catholic Church kept that communitarian model, and some of that got lost in Protestantism.
Yeah.
Right. So are you primarily community? Or are you primarily individual? Jesus, as a Jew, is primarily community. And that's why he teaches his followers to say our Father rather than my Father.
Yeah, I mean, do you have any other thoughts on like what, like, because you sorry, I'm going a little off script, but you spent time teaching in Rome, you spent time obviously with Catholics and Protestants and people of all sorts of backgrounds. Do you have any thoughts on like the Jewishness of Catholicism, or like what do you see in Catholicism that you're kind of like, oh, that's kind of reminiscent of my tradition?
All religions, or at least Judaism, forms of Judaism and Christianity for the most part. And I can't speak professionally about other traditions. If I can't read the primary sources, I'm not going to talk about them professionally.
Yeah.
So I can't read Sanskrit, for example. Doing the biblical languages was enough. There are all certain similarities. The worship service is similar. And the Catholic Church, with the idea of the sacrifice of the Mass, kept the temple language better than the Protestants did. So I think that's helpful. The Catholic Church, with its liturgical calendar, some Protestant communions have those, and the Anglicans have them. But the Catholic Church, I think, kept the Jewish, in the sense of the Jewish liturgical calendar. Part of that got lost when it went to the solar calendar rather than lunar. Catholic Church, with its concern for eating, with feast days and fast days, And I'm old enough to remember, fish on Fridays before that got changed. My family was in the fishing business. That was not a good change. That has a sort of dietary regulation model to it, which has some sort of connection with Judaism. Worshiping in the body. And the Protestants more so went to it's the spirit rather than the body. Mm-hmm. Catholic Church kept a focus on the body. Now, that's not to say that the Protestant churches don't have really good things. I mean, we all should have some sort of spiritual envy, where certain churches do certain things really, really well. Mm-hmm. So that I can go to a Catholic mass or a Presbyterian service or a Baptist service and go, boy, they did that really well. Baptists, when they're on a roll, they can preach, right? Church of Christ, they can sing a cappella better than anybody else ever anywhere. So there are all certain liturgical formulations or biblical interpretation formulations or movements of the spirit or whatever it is. We all have certain gifts, and I don't like saying, this church got it right and this church got it wrong. It's just like they all got it different.
Yeah.
And how much of the past you hold on to? Well, that past is itself remarkably diverse, because what's going on in the synagogue is not what's going on in the temple, is not what's going on in somebody's courtyard. But those are all sites of religious activity.
Yeah. And, I'm interested too. And also, originally the next question was just going to be like, to what extent do you think it's necessary to understand Jesus' Jewishness? But I feel like we've already kind of covered that. And so I'm interested then on, once you include the Jewishness of Jesus, especially let's say for a Christian who is studying his or her theology, right? Do you think that changes or shifts anything possibly? Or, what kind of changes would emerge within like the Christian mind on thinking about Jesus?
You can begin by correcting the errors or the misunderstandings and the negative stereotypes that Christians have. So that if a Christian, and I know this because I work in churches and because I teach divinity students. So if the Christian begins with the presupposition that first century Judaism so oppressed women that they were completely marginalized, and then Jesus invents feminism, then you're going to miscue Jesus and you're going to miscue first century Judaism. So the reverse of that is to use the New Testament to reconstruct the lives of Jewish women in the first century. And what do we know? Well, they own their own homes because Martha welcomed him into her home. And the house church in Jerusalem is at the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, right? And she's got a gate with a slave and all that. So it's kind of upscale. They have access to their own money because it's women who are floating the mission because Jesus isn't taking any money for the healthcare. They have freedom of travel, which is how Mary can visit Elizabeth and how women can follow Jesus from Galilee up in the north to Jerusalem in the south. They appear in public and nobody goes, oh my God, it's a woman in public. So you take away the negative image of the unfortunate stereotype of Judaism as representing misogyny. And then you can see Jesus talking to Jewish women, and he's not elevating them because they're already elevated. And you get a better sense of, okay, now you get that out of the way. Now you can actually do something with the text. Or when you see Jesus arguing with fellow Jews, that's not throwing Protestants. When they argue with somebody, they found another denomination, right? So when Jesus argues with fellow Jews, that's what Jews do, because Jews are an ethnic group. We're a people. We're kind of like Americans, and Americans obviously don't disagree on things, except agree on things. But we know at the end of the day, we're all still Americans. Well, Jews can argue till the Messiah comes, or if you want, comes back. It doesn't throw you out. So that when Jesus argues with Pharisees or scribes or lawyers about Torah, usually translated law, better translation is instruction, that doesn't mean he disregards Torah. That means he thinks it's so important he's going to argue for it, because that's what Jews do. And if Christians took that seriously, they would be in a better position to argue about how they interpret the New Testament as well as the Old. Right? So if you get rid of the negative stereotypes, you're in a much better position to focus on what's important in the text, rather than showing Jesus correcting something that didn't need to be corrected.
Yeah. And so, that getting into now the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, some people say that like Christianity just totally broke away from Judaism, or Christianity totally replaced Judaism. What do you think is a better view of the relationship between the two faiths? I mean,
well, if Christianity totally replaced Judaism, then you have to explain why they were still Jews. So that argument on its own doesn't follow very well. Christianity eventually became a Gentile church. There are Messianic Jews. There are Messianic Jews today who fall into various categories because, of course, they don't agree either. Um, uh, but the New Testament, does, as I read it, and here I look at Paul primarily, does not expect a replacement. The Gentile church is not a replacement of the Jewish church; it's an add-on. In the Gospel of Matthew, which does come first in the canon, although I do think Matthew was reliant on Mark as a source.
Yeah.
Matthew has Jesus say, I'm in chapter 10, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And to the Canaanite lady, he repeats it. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel in 1524. So that when you have the Great Commission at the end of the Gospels, it's 28, 19, go make disciples of all the Gentiles. Translate all the nations if you want. The Greek is panta te ethne, ethne like ethnic. He doesn't say, and screw those damn Jews, right? So the mission to the Jews continues, but Matthew's pretty clear that, well, it's not really going anywhere, so we'll leave it open, but we're going to focus on the Gentiles, and that's fine. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, you weeping over Jerusalem, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, which means he expects there to be Jews in Jerusalem to welcome him when he gets back. So at least for Luke, Jews still have a role. And we've already noted in Romans 11, Paul says that, the gifts and calling are irrevocable. And so Jews have all that stuff. And it doesn't mean that God sort of said, okay, you had these here and now we're going to give them to the Gentile church. Irrevocable means irrevocable. It stays permanent. All those gifts and calling remain in place. So yes, the church is, the general view of the New Testament is that Jesus is the Christ. And Jesus is that final judge, and he is Lord and Savior. But that doesn't mean that the Jews are screwed. And that doesn't mean, Jews here who don't believe in Jesus. And it doesn't mean that God has revoked his covenant with the Jews. From the New Testament perspective, the Jews still have a role to play. Now, if you ask your local Jew who's not a Messianic Jew, so what do you think is your role in Christian salvation history? The local Jews goes, it's not my problem. Mm-hmm. So now this then becomes a question for the church. What are you going to do with the Jews? You're going to let God take care of us? Are you going to attempt to evangelize us? Are you going to love us because we are members of the covenant and we are still under God's divine protection? Are you going to care for us because we are the ones who preserved your Torah for you, your Old Testament? That's something the church needs to work out. For me personally, don't kill me. That's a good start. Don't blow up my synagogue. Don't tell my kids they're going to go to hell. I have a very low bar. And if I'm not hurt and my children aren't hurt, that's already a step in the right direction.
Yeah. And so, I've sometimes heard the terms dual covenant theology versus supersessionism, right? And I'm wondering, I don't know if those terms are helpful at all, but so I take it that dual covenant theology is saying that the old covenant and the new covenant are both simultaneously valid, right? Whereas supersessionism is kind of saying the new covenant has kind of invalidated the old and has become the new kind of model, at least for Christians. And so I'm interested
the way I read the New Testament is I'm sort of in between here.
Sure.
And notice I'm taking a Protestant approach. I'm just reading the New Testament. I'm not looking at the church fathers, who had their own things to say. So how Christians cash out on this depends upon the type of Christian that you are. So Augustine had some things to say about this, and Aquinas had some things to say about this. But I'm just looking at the New Testament. I dual covenant in the sense that the covenant with Israel is never revoked. And it's not supersessionism in the sense that, which is sometimes called replacement theology, right. In the sense that the Gentile churches replaces the Jewish covenant. But I do think that although the Jewish covenant is still in place for the New Testament, Christ is still Lord. So although the Jewish covenant is still in place, it's got an add-on, which is also in place. So rather than replacement, perhaps addition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a helpful way of looking at it. And I guess, one big question that's been on my mind. And so personally for me, I love studying the Jewish roots of the New Testament and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I've looked into, is the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees. And that's been a huge kind of center point between Christian and Jewish interfaith dialogue, right? And so here's my question here. My question is, what was the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees? Or even, we could talk about Jesus and the Torah, right? Because, maybe we can start there and then we can go into the second question that I have there. But first, what was
let's start
that
with
relationship?
Jesus and Torah then.
Yeah.
Jesus interprets Torah, and he makes it more rigorous rather than less rigorous. He's not lightening it up, he's tightening it. And he's doing what Rabbinic Judaism, and here I'm citing the first verse of a rabbinic document called Pirkei Avot. It's in the Mishnah.
Yeah.
It means ethics of the fathers. What he's doing is what the rabbis call building a fence about the law. So what do? You want to protect the law to make sure that it remains what it is and people don't break it. So you make a second law to make sure you don't violate the first one. So what does he do? The law says don't murder. He says don't be angry, right? Because if you're not angry, you're less likely to murder. That's building a fence about the law. Right? The law says don't commit adultery. He says don't think about it. That's harder, right? He never abrogates any law. And even when you get to the you have heard it said an eye for an eye, what he does is he changes the subject. Because there's a big difference between losing an eye and getting slapped on the cheek, right? But if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the other. It's like you lose a limb, that's different than a backhanded slap of dismissal. Because Jesus is not going around saying, gee, somebody just poked out your eye deliberately, just say my bad and then go on with it. Right. So in that case, he changes the subject. He's a Jew who's interpreting Torah, as other Jews did. Pharisees interpreted Torah, Sadducees interpreted you had to. And did they agree? No. And why should they? Right. So if you think about American law, right? So we have, things like the amendments to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. You can say something like, we have the right to bear arms. Well, does that mean you can stockpile Uzis or Kalashnikovs? Does that mean, well, in Tennessee, it's open carry without a permit. Can you bring your gun into church? If somebody says you can't bring your gun into the church, is that anti-American or is that pro-American? So the law says honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Don't work on the Sabbath. And then you have to figure out what constitutes work. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. So of course he's going to be debating this stuff and other Jews are going to be debating it. And when he debates it according to Jewish terms. He says things like, well, if your sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're going to pull it up, right? And that was actually, it's an argument from the lesser to the greater, which is a standard Jewish, if it works for this, then surely it would work for that. Mm-hmm. Or he argues by precedent. Oh, well, David went into the temple and he ate the food that he wasn't supposed to. He actually misquotes the text, which is kind of funny. So of course you're hungry. Of course you're going to eat, right? Just standard Jewish arguments. There's nothing surprising here. They're not giving up on Torah. They're just interpreting it in their own way, as did the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and as did the Pharisees. And the Pharisees didn't agree with each other, as did the Sadducees, as did people in some Galilean village. Well, over here in Capernaum, we do it this way. Well, we don't do it that way in Nazareth, right? But you're all still Jews. That's part of his culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we can go now from the Torah, I guess, to the Pharisees themselves. So one question you could ask yourself is, was Jesus a Pharisee, or, did he just totally reject the authority of the rabbis and the Pharisees altogether? What's his relationship with them? What's going on with his critiques?
First of all, Pharisees aren't rabbis. So when we talk about rabbis, Jesus, he gets called rabbi in the Gospel of John, like Mary Magdalene in John 20. It's Rabboni, right? So the resurrection's a great scene. When we talk about rabbis, we're talking about rabbinic literature, and that's primarily post 70. The mission is written down, first major document of rabbinic teaching is written down about the year 200, 220 or so. So some of it goes back to the time of Jesus, but trying to figure out how much goes back to the first century and how much is early second century. The major rabbis who get referenced in rabbinic literature live about 100 years after Jesus. Mm-hmm. So he's not part of that group. Okay. In terms of the Pharisees, as I mentioned, the only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. Josephus talks about the Pharisees, but Josephus writes a lot. Okay. And if you look at how much he says about the Pharisees compared to how much else, Pharisees are very, very minor part of the Josephus's corpus. We just make a big deal of it because they show up in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. The New Testament tells us that there are other Pharisees who joined the movement, and you can see that in the book of Acts. Right? So the Pharisees who were part, besides Paul, right? They show up in Acts 10, they show up in Acts 15. So he can't be so far away from the Pharisees that no Pharisee would ever think of joining this thing. It may well be that the reason we have all these debates, there are a couple of reasons that we have all these debates between Jesus and the Pharisees is one, they're so close. This is what Freud would call the narcissism of minor differences, right? The closer you are, the more you got to debate. Baptists and Methodists, they have to debate a lot. Catholics and Baptists, let's let it go. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
Right. Kentucky and Tennessee, we worry about it. Tennessee and Maine, it's irrelevant. because they care about the same things. And they're both taking the law, and they're both out among the people, and they're both adapting Torah to help people figure out, how do you do this, and what kind of guide can you be? Josephus, who's not a Pharisee, he thinks they've kind of up-jumped, like they've gotten above their station, because Josephus thinks the people ought to be listening to the priests like him, and they're not. They're listening to Pharisees who are a lay-led group, right? Priesthood is inherited, right? You're born into the priesthood. Pharisees is a lay-led group, like a voluntary society. And the people are listening to these Pharisees, and Josephus is going, hey, like, you're not upper class, you're not. And they're known for walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So in the Gospel of Luke, when Luke says, and the Pharisees who were lovers of money, blah, 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 Josephus says, they like the simple life. It's the priests who were like the really upper class. Lovers of money is a standard insult back then, by the way. You don't like somebody, say you're a lover of money and you sleep with your mom. It's a standard insult.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're close, and that's why they debate. And the other reason is because after the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees were basically there to pick up all the pieces, because the priesthood had lost its power base because it lost its temple.
Yeah.
And the Pharisees had been there anyway. So they're your major competition to the early followers of Jesus following the destruction of the temple. And I think a lot of the really severe language is probably later and then retrojected back onto the lips of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm especially thinking about, like Matthew 23, 2-3, right? Which is such a strange.
Scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, pay attention to them.
Yeah. So like for the audience, if I'll read it real quick. So, it says, this is Jesus speaking. He says, the scribes.
You're not impressed that I knew what that verse was?
No, I'm not. No. I'm actually,
I'm just showing off, and I want to be acknowledged for like knowing.
Oh, well, that was Dr. Levine. I mean, your knowledge of the Bible, you're second to none.
Thank you. Okay, move on.
Okay. And so just to read it real quick, it says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. And then he goes on into, giving his critique in verse 4.
Yeah, to excoriate them, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And Josephus says they actually practice. And I have a sense that they probably did, because if they didn't, people know a hypocrite when they see one.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pharisees would not have been nearly as popular if they were all known as hypocrites.
Yeah. So then, what do we make of then Jesus saying they sit on, on the seat of Moses, right? And, do what they do what they teach you, right? So he kind of cites Deuteronomy 17:11 in that passage, which is kind of the basis for the later authority of the rabbis, and so on and so forth. I mean, what's going on here?
Or this is not Jesus, this is Matthew.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Saying, you know what? They a lot of this stuff they got right. So the issue is less behavior. That's the teaching part. This, what do you do? And we would call this orthopraxy, but it's also civil law. What do you do if your neighbor's ox gores your ox? Right? So you need some sort of mechanism to deal with that. So the big debate is not so much what they do, it's their Christology or their theology. They're denying the Christhood of Jesus of Nazareth. That's the problem. So if somebody is in power but doesn't agree with what you agree with theologically, try to strip away their power.
Yeah, but when we consider, for instance, something like the criterion of embarrassment, right? And so I don't know, it depends on how one measures authenticity, right? So for instance, when the Gospels talk about, it says Jesus, King of the Jews, right above his head while he's being crucified. Dale Martin and others have argued that, that seems authentic because that doesn't seem like something the Christians would invent, right? My inclination here is that with Matthew 23, 2-3, I mean, it could probably fall under the criterion of embarrassment, right? You wouldn't expect the Christians to be saying this.
I don't think the criterion of embarrassment has any cachet whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I think the criterion of authenticity have proven that they do not work. The only people who are using them now are fundamentalist Christians attempting to prove everything that Jesus said and did shows up in the New Testament. And the people I know who are still using those criteria have yet to find something that didn't turn out to be historical.
Okay.
So the criterion of I'm presuming your viewers, your audience know what this is, right?
Yeah.
So if it's something that would embarrass the church, then it had to have happened, because otherwise they wouldn't put it in there. Is the reverse of that is if it embarrassed them, then they wouldn't have put it in there. So obviously it didn't embarrass them. We're inventing a community. We're inventing the community's values, and then we're reading the text in light of this community we've just invented. So all the criteria basically give us a circular argument, and I don't think they work. I don't think Matthew was embarrassed by that at all. In terms of the titulus on the cross, which is Jesus of Nazareth, and however many languages, whatever. If most people can't read, so it really doesn't matter. Could that have been historical? Sure. Wouldn't have surprised me. Pilate is perfectly happy to humiliate the Jews under his control. This would be a nice way of doing it, and it's a fabulous form of free advertising. You say you got a king, here's what Rome does to your king. That would make sense. But to claim that a gospel writer would write something and then be embarrassed by it just strikes me as counterintuitive. Gospel writers aren't stupid, and gospel writers can omit or add anything they want.
All right, Dr. Levine, let me ask you kind of two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So this question here is, you kind of talked about it already, about stereotypes that some Christians have about Jews, but I'm interested in just like, what are some other ones that we got to watch out for, right? So, don't be a Pharisee, or stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to be a sheep, as the children's song goes by. Better career aspirations than to be a sheep. The Jews, for Jews, God had become sort of distant, transcendent king, and Jesus invented the loving daddy Abba God, and that Abba means daddy, which it doesn't. Just means father. That Jews are all, anytime you get the all Jews thought, I mean, that's already a problem, right? Yeah. Because there's no like Jew think, and we don't have creeds. That all Jews are expecting a militant Messiah, and they rejected Jesus because he talked about peace, forgetting about the fact that his followers are armed. They have multiple messianic views at the time. In terms of the culture, that Rome was like the worst thing ever. Empires have their really bad moments, but empires have some good moments, like peace in the empire, and building the aqueduct. Okay, granted, Pilate used the temple treasury to do that, which was not a smart thing, but boy, they needed that aqueduct. So you have to be careful about the empire critical studies or post-colonial studies that impose their own particular stereotypes on the first century. What else? We've already talked about women. That Jews thought if you were rich, you were pious, and if you were poor, you were sinful. And when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," everybody would have gone, "Oh my God, wait, go read Amos, go read Deuteronomy, read Job." It's like this nonsense thing, which gets Jews involved with economic issues, which are much later. That Jews thought that God didn't give a care about the Gentiles whatsoever, and they were highly xenophobic and didn't want to have anything to do with Gentiles. And when Peter says in Acts 10, it's not lawful for us to visit a Gentile, well, that's nonsense. Of course it's lawful, because the outer court of the temple is the court of the Gentiles. You don't welcome Gentiles into your holiest place if you want nothing to do with them. I mean, that's also counterintuitive. And we know that there were Gentiles in synagogues that are called God-fearers, and you think of them as like affiliates who like hanging out with Jews, but will not convert for a variety of different reasons. It's basically this sense of we need to have. If you're sick, you're sinful. I have nothing wrong with Peter's mother-in-law than the fact that she has a fever, but I don't think she's committing adultery on the side. That purity laws are oppressive and terrible, and Jesus does away with purity laws. No, he restores people to states of ritual purity. So he's affirming the purity laws rather than doing away with them. So, I mean, there's a whole list of them. The shepherds would have been unclean, and therefore it would have been, no, shepherds are just shepherds. They hang out with sheep. They might have needed a shower, but that's not the same thing as, whether they just ejaculated or not. So total misunderstanding of how the purity system functions.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you now one last question. So, Dr. Levine, if you could ask Jesus one question, what would it be?
I have more than one question.
How many do you need?
Yeah, I'm talking to Jesus now. So this is if you had one wish, what would you wish for? I wish for more wishes. I would not want to limit that to one question. I have multiple questions.
Yeah. You can just go down the list if you want to. Yeah, I won't stop you.
Like, who do you think you are?
Yeah.
Let's revert. What are people saying about? What do you think?
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Why did you use the title Son of Man, and did you use it every time it shows up, or was it added on in certain cases? Did you expect to return during the lifetime of your original followers? What did you do in the temple, and what did you say, if anything? Because it keeps changing as you go from gospel to gospel. I'm not sure you did anything, because if you did, I can't understand why they let you come back and teach the next day. That's bad business for the temple. Were you celibate? Because I think he was. And what do you think about the gift of celibacy? And we know that there are other celibate Jews in the first century. That's one of those cases where in the divorce, the Catholic Church got celibacy and Jews, that we lost that one. How much of the Gospels strike you as getting you correct? Lots of questions. Tell me about your mom, because I really like Mary. Tell me about this. Tell me about what you really thought about Peter, and was he really just as clueless as he seems to be on some cases, or, all sorts of questions. Because every time I read the New Testament and I look at just a verse or a word, it reminds me of something else that I hadn't thought about before, which is why I can continue to study it after all these years. I'm old. I've been doing this a long time. And it's ever replenishing. So doing a Bible study with Jesus, kind of like the two on the road to Emmaus, how fabulous would that be?
Well, Dr. Levine, thank you so much for this interview. I've had a great time talking to you, and I really love and appreciate all the work that you're doing. And Dr. Levine, are you, is there a website or a way that other people can connect with your work? Are you working on anything new?
Yeah, and they should still call me AJ, as should you.
Oh, sorry.
So I have a Facebook page, but I don't know how it works. So once a week, my daughter, who's my wonderful daughter, updates it for me and tells me, somebody's written to you on something, or whether you need to answer this. But if I don't learn, and it's deliberate not learning, right? I could if I wanted to. I just don't, because I figure if I got into Facebook, I'd fall down that rabbit hole and never get back. So people can track me on that. And I'm kind of out there. So if I will be back on the road starting in September, COVID permitting. And I'm doing a lot of Zoom conversations. So churches like Zoom me in for an hour Q&A, or to do a lecture or something like that. So if you go on the internet, I'm there. I'm very, very easy to find.
Well, AJ, thank you so much for coming on to my show.
A pleasure to talk with you. And if any of your listeners or viewers have questions, they can track me down. That would be fun. And if there are a whole lot of them, then we can come back and do this again.